A few months ago, I reviewed the Smiths Everest PRS 25. It's a watch that I deeply enjoy wearing, not only because of its background, but just in the way it pays tribute to the Everest ascent. It has a great story behind it. This time around, we will be looking at something quite special from Timefactors. A debut of a brand new model that's taken over a year to develop. This is the first time I have been asked to review a watch for a company. Not just any watch, but currently the only prototype in the world. So it's pretty special, and I am very grateful. So thank you, Eddie, at Timefactors, for this opportunity. If all goes well, the first batch of these pieces will be cased and assembled by August or September 2020. We start by looking at a brief history of field watches. Contractually built for armed forces, found their footing originally in the 1940s. Soldiers from both the Axis and Allied powers were given watches as a part of their equipment, and for the first time, watches were designed and made in mass for thousands of men. What makes field watches so interesting? Yes, they have been well documented and are historically relevant, but even more so because they were all built around certain specifications, made to be water resistant, with bulletproof, simple manual wound movements, legible, with basic indices, a use of radium paint for easy time-telling distinction in low light or the dark. Sizes of these pieces were also important, applicable for their setting. Some were small and worn under clothing, others were made to be worn over gloves and jackets, others had complications like chronographs with telemeter scales. They all were built for a purpose. One of the most famous set of pieces to come out of the Second World War were the Dirty Dozen. 12 brands who in their own factories followed a required set of specifications and created, many would argue, the original field watches in mass for the Ministry of Defence and the British Armed Forces. Something less known, of the 12 brands, one was not only supplying the Allies, but also the Axis powers. You see, IWC Schaffhausen, technically, bordering both Switzerland and Germany, was essentially neutral, not biased to the politics on either side. Along with creating the iconic Flieger watches with their partners like Larco, Stover and Alango and Zona for the Axis forces, they also produced field watches next to the names of Omega, Jaeger-LeCoultre and Longines for the Allies. Talk about a profitable business model. The Flieger watch, being made with a never-before-seen case with dimensions in excess of 50 millimeters, built with a strong focus on the watch's dial architecture, using a combination of batons and numerals, where the numerals and minute track take center stage. A triangle at the 12 with 2 dots on either side of it managed to help center the eye on the dial. But this watch really was inspired by the instrument clusters used in aeroplane cockpits of the time as well. The field watches were built to have a divide between a legible sub-seconds dial that was fairly oversized, but also a clear set of numerals around the dial, surrounded by a rail track for the minutes, legible, simple, easy to wear. And here at this time, we see the IWC Mark X make an appearance, one of the rarest and most sought after in the collection of Dirty Dozen pieces. The war ended. German manufacturing was either halted or used by the powers who divided up the country, so many names like Stover and Larco, others, disappeared, but IWC kept its ties with the Allied forces since it was technically neutral. So we arrive in the 1950s, and the British Ministry of Defence requests for Navigator watches to be made for their RAF pilots. 2 manufacturers are elected to create a batch of new pieces, IWC and JLC. And as manufacturers, they were thrown quite a curveball. The watch needed a highly accurate movement, an iron inner cage that screened the movement from magnetism, a stainless steel waterproof case. It was a watch supposed to be made for pilots, so the Flieger element should take center stage, but then they also needed to act as field watches for day-to-day use, and as astronavigational instruments, they were essentially built to be fail-safes for the pilots if their electronic navigational equipment failed. And so the legendary Mark 11 was born, a watch bought and utilized by the British, Australian, New Zealand and South African armed forces from the 1950s until 1963. And were officially decommissioned in 1981. What made this watch special? Just look at it. One of the most interesting and peculiar amalgamations of a pilot's watch and a field watch in one package, and this piece, especially the Mark 11, has been touted as one of the most collectible military-issued watches of all time, We could go so far to say that it is considered to be the ultimate field watch, one that has bridged the gap between vintage and modern approaches during the nuclear age, so nowadays they are rare and expensive. If we know just where British military designated field watches moved after the Mark 11 disappeared in 1963, we saw the introduction of the Smiths W10, made in England, following the same set of cues left by field watches before it. The question we have to ask is, what if Smiths was contracted to build a Mark 11 watch like the IWCs and JLCs at the time in the 1950s? How would they approach it? And that is exactly what Eddie, the owner of Timefactors, set out to do when deciding to create a tribute piece. A year ago I was contacted by him with one line saying, "You might be interested in this." And in the email he shared a technical drawing of what clearly looked to be a Mark 11. I was intrigued. He was still deep in the revision phase, but the seed had been planted. So what made manufacturing this watch so difficult? Firstly, every part of the watch is unique. Dial, handset, and most importantly, the case and crown. Secondly, the tolerances. See, what makes the Mark 11 such a unique beast is that it has a very distinct case styling. Long lugs with a curve unlike conventional pieces. The rounded case sits squat on the wrist, and the crown needs to be a larger than average size to accommodate daily wearing. And it was finalizing those details to create a near perfect form that mirrored the originals that took the longest time. The greatest irony of all is that it took 11 revisions before the prototype that you're seeing was produced, and as of right now, they are the only two in the world. The Smiths Navigator, tribute to Mark 11. Basic specifications. The watch measures 36 mm in diameter, has a lug width of 18 mm, a lug-to-lug length of 46 mm, and an overall thickness of 11 mm, including a boxed sapphire crystal that measures 2 mm. It must be emphasized that all the proportions are accurate to the original, and that's really one of the greatest features of this piece in particular. 100 meters water resistant, uses a hand-wound Sellita SW210 movement that is accurate and has been regulated to COSC chronometer standards. And with every model in this line, this watch is no exception, has an iron cage around the movement. 20,000 amperes per meter, making it highly anti-magnetic. The movement accuracy, anti-magnetic properties, all accurate to the original as well. It will come standard with a heavy-duty pigskin leather strap and deployant clasp. Not a standard deployant, one that allows for the excess length of strap to tuck under the wrist, giving it a much cleaner look. And it also has a vintage Smiths logo etched onto the clasp for added detail. The strap is very practical for everyday wear, but also bear in mind that the lugs are drilled for easy strap changes, so there's no problems there. The crown is smooth to pull out and adjust, the Sellita movement is crunchy, and the stem is very well reinforced with no wobble whatsoever. Turning the watch around, it has an engraved caseback, true to the original pieces with a large broad arrow. And here's a detail that many enthusiasts will enjoy. If I'm not mistaken, the Navigator has a legitimate series of NATO stocking numbers assigned to it, designating the Air Force branch it would be supplied to, with many other details. We will be receiving two variants of the Navigator, a black dial and a cream dial, and both evoke a different feeling. I see the black dial and I think of the 50s. The cream dial feels much more like a piece from the 40s. All models come with C3 Superluminova and is set in such a way that is accurate to the originals, highlighting the quarters and the hands. If you ever wanted a piece that screams pilot watch, this loom arrangement does it for you. That's enough with the specifics. Let's actually talk about what it's like to wear. What impression does it give you? I'll be honest. Put my hand up. The Flieger aesthetic has never appealed to me much. Compared to other sports, dress and utility watches out there, the Flieger dial has never really caught my attention or held it for an extended period of time. Maybe because it feels too much like an instrument, something that you would find on a dial inside an aircraft, and less as something that you would see on a watch face. Another element that has never appealed to me is the size of these models. Now granted, the scales have been reduced with modern pieces, but even still, the size of these watches are greater than average. And if I can't wear the piece comfortably, I would never be able to appreciate it fully. What these watches manage to understand better than most is how proportions are shared between numerals, minute track, handsets, next to the general space on the dial. just how legible they are to look at, how easy reading the time is. So when we see what the Mark 11 design managed to do, we clearly see how the Flieger characteristics have taken center stage. We notice the method of how the numerals have been placed on the dial. Even the typeface shared between the Pilot and the Mark 11 are virtually identical. But then what softens the overall impact is that the minute track is lighter, with every 5-minute mark almost making contact with the individual numerals. So what does this do? It makes the dial breathe more. The triangle at the top and the rectangles at the quarters act almost like a crosshair, which helps center your eye. The hour hand with an aggressive rectangle cutoff lets you track the hour quickly. It also pairs nicely with the batons at the quarters, which leads you to follow the much longer minute hand, and the white seconds hand completes the formula. Though quirky in some places, undeniably, some might find the elements peculiar, this model addressed legibility first. And during my time of wearing the watch, I've never had to read the dial twice after glancing at it. The formula, strange as it might seem at first, is extremely effective. Also pay attention to how the triangle, the vintage Smiths logo, and the arrow sit so neatly together. And beneath you see the encircled L, signifying Luminova. Then if we are to look at the lugs and the case, they are very specific to the Mark 11, which is actually the hardest detail to nail correctly with the recreations, keeping with the much more rounded forms, with a near vertical protrusion of the lugs. There is a very organic, smoother transition. And actually the case is really what shows the watch's age. It feels like a field watch created in the late 40s, and so much care has been put into capturing that unique aspect. The same can be said about the transition between the case, bezel, and crystal. The greatest thing of all is that it is so wearable. You forget you have it on your wrist, and in my book, that's a good thing. It also means that it can accommodate virtually any wrist size. So when you're wearing the watch, it's a pleasure. It doesn't feel ostentatious in the slightest. It really does put you in the old boots, so to speak. It's compact, comfortable, and not something that stands out as an overbearing watch. This coming from someone who has a pretty average-sized wrist. This piece feels small, and that is what gave these original navigational watches such an edge. I've come to call it a mini Flieger, because that is essentially what it is. And it's the first Flieger I can actually wear comfortably for days, without any feeling of fatigue or noticing that the watch feels out of place with what I'm wearing or what I'm doing. That being said, the overall aesthetic of the piece, its size, its scale, the dial, it does feel old-fashioned and evokes the feeling of wearing a classic. It's a beautiful thing. Looking at the watch in its completed form, and I have said this before, it not only appears, but feels like a watch designed and conceived by an enthusiast. The details are everywhere, and like with so many of the watches that come from Timefactors and the Smiths name, it feels very professional. You could put the IWC or the JLC name on this watch and you wouldn't be the wiser. That's how sharp it is. And that is ultimately why I agree to write and review watches like these. Just picking it up and handling it, you can feel the attention that has gone into every detail. I don't see this watch as an homage. Though, if any watch deserved an homage, it is the Mark 11, and this does fall into that category. But the Smiths Navigator truly is a legitimate interpretation of a classic, asking the question of how would Smiths address a Mark 11. And it is believable, because they were in the running back in the day, actually building rare field watch models in the 50s. So hypothetically, this could have come true. But this interpretation, being executed so neatly, is quite a triumph in my book. It really feels like it opens up a new chapter. An homage that never truly has been made so accurately before, lovingly recreated. And it's a shame that I have to send them back.